Hey guys! So today you and I are going to talk about learning architecture. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, how to learn architecture, sir? Well, I do believe that I am a sir, perhaps, but you don't have to be all that. You can be casual, guys. You don't worry about it. I'm really not that sort of person where I put a lot of I don't put a lot of emphasis on stuff like that. However, my answer to this question might not be the best one because I will argue that architecture, depending on what you mean by architecture now, because some people will talk about design patterns, some will talk about always, are you talking about like at a corporate enterprise level, like if you're a system architect or something like that, or a solution architect, etc., etc., etc. Some might talk about in the code, how do you architecture your system at like a source code level or repository architecture. There's so like architecture could mean so many things. I argue at the very least, and so I'm just going to interpret it as that you're trying to, in general, just get better at how to structure systems. Because, as I said, you can do that. It's applicable all the way from how you position your files on the file system in terms of like where your source code files are, how they are written, all the way up to how the entire system works with services and like infrastructure and cloud providers and so forth and so forth. So what I'm going to say is that the best approach, I argue, that's the one that I've been using, and so of course I think that it is the best approach. I'm sure that everybody can agree, is to work in a lot of different companies. That's the best approach. Because the tricky part about architecture, if you go and study it in theory, is that you will be taught a architecture usually, but it is extremely difficult from just being taught a architecture like CQRS, microservices, monoliths, or SOA, depending on how you want to think about microservices versus SOA and stuff like that. Like there's, or event-based architectures or so forth. There's tons of various ways of doing things. And what's an architecture, what's in, not an architecture, what is in scope, what is out of scope. And it's said it can include so many things. So if you learn about it at a theoretical level, I argue at the very least, and this is the thing that I usually get as criticism to professional enterprise architects, that if all you know is how to draw boxes on a flow chart in order to highlight your architecture, I will argue that you will be very ineffective at designing good systems, which fundamentally is what an architecture should be about. And I've worked with quite a lot of architects who call up to me and try to ask me, how does the architecture work? Because their job is to write a spreadsheet or like to create a flow chart of boxes. But my job is to know how it actually works and why we have made the technical decisions that we have made. And that's why I argue that the best architects are always going to be real seniors, or people who actually understand the whole like stack, like how they actually work with their entire system. And the reason why is because they've been around long enough so that they know that if you have a monolith, these are the things that usually happen. If you have microservices, these are the things that usually happen. If you have so like the various architectures, they have pros and they have cons, and certain systems require one, or I'm not going to say always require. In some situations, one architecture will have a great effect, a positive effect, and in some situations it might have a very negative effect. It really is a very, I would even go as far as to say, guys, that this is not good architecture is not an exact science. It is an art form. It is based on a lot of experience working with various types of systems that gives you that holistic insight, that gives you an understanding of Windows, for example. When would you use CQRS? And when would you not? Now, if you ask the .NET developers, that's for every project, right? Because everything is about the clean architecture and everything is using Mediator and Automapper, of course. And for the Java developers, they kind of go, don't really know. Probably same thing with the Node.js developers and things like that. And then if you ask, and this is my favorite one because CQRS might be an extreme case, but I will give you a challenge and to sort of see if you can figure out what I'm talking about. If most teams today, I would argue, they usually stand on the threshold between picking a monolithic architecture for their system versus a microservices architecture. Most of them, or SOA, depending on how you want to talk about microservices. And that is one of the most common questions they have. Which one do we pick? And that, I would argue, is a good beginner thing to understand. When do you pick one or the other? And what's even more important is to understand, how do I make each, like when I made the pick, how do I make these architectures work? Because, guys, I have seen people use microservices that they did it in such, I call it, it's not even microservices, I argue, it's a distributed monolith. They created a microservices architecture, quote unquote, use the right architecture, and my department had to, well, they gave, like the management gave over the entire product to us because they could never deliver anything. So they had the modern architecture, but the system was so sucky that basically they lost control of it. And the same thing goes for monoliths. There's quite a lot of people who hate monoliths, some swear by them, etc., etc. And so that's the thing that I argue that you should be doing. When you work in various projects and you try out you experiment with different setups, and especially when you work in different companies, because various companies have different types of architectures, even if they are every other company is going to use a monolith of some sort, or a microservices architecture, or these flavors, like they will use the same terminology for a lot of the architectures that they talk about, but they always differ. The details, it's always in the details. So observe those details that differ between company to company and system to system, and start trying to see what patterns that emerges. And when you can answer that question, when do I to pick a monolith and when do I pick microservices, and how do I make each work as well as possible? Like, what are the details that I need to get right in those two types of setups so that they really, really work really, really well? That's when you're starting to understand architecture. And that's where I argue that it's the same thing with CQRS or event-based or whatever. Like, these architectures, they are just general guidelines for how to structure a system, but everything is always into the details. And always remember that it does not matter which architecture you have if you don't understand the problem that you are solving. Because if you don't understand what your system is supposed to be doing and like what it has to be able to do and so forth, and you just pick an architecture based on some arbitrary understanding of what is good practice, odds are, as in my little example there, you're going to pick an architecture that is quote unquote the hip thing or the best thing and so forth, but the system is going to turn out shit, and then you failed. Because architecture is about creating well-scalable, like well-working systems that scale well over time and are easy to make updates to and so forth and so forth. That's the whole point of it. And so if you don't know what problem you're trying to solve, what type of system you're trying to build, then it's really tricky for you to just decide on an architecture. And that's why I argued that it's easier for you to work on a lot of projects, see how you build those systems, and then from that realize that, that's here a monolith makes a lot of sense, or here microservices makes a lot of sense, or CQRS would be a requirement for this sort of system, because if we don't do it this way, it's going to be a massive problem for us, and so forth and so forth. Those insights, that's life experience, and I argue that is the best way to learn architecture. So what I want you to take away from this is that if you're going to follow my tried and true method for learning architecture and getting really good at it, I would say that go to a lot of projects, work on various types of systems, work on the various types of programs, understand how to determine what the different, like you can go and look at them, like you can go and get the basic understanding of it so that you at least understand the terminology. Because when I throw around words like monolith, microservices, SOA, CQRS, event-based, like so forth and so forth, there's a ton of different architecture. You can go and look at the theory and and I argue, just if you're new to this, treat it a little bit as design patterns or anything like that. Just accept that you can learn about it because it's interesting to you. Don't mistake that you know some theory for you to have like that very deep understanding, because that deep understanding and really knowing your stuff takes practice. That practice is more important than anything else, because I can promise you guys, I find all the time that I try to describe something, like a way that I want to design something or build something in code, and someone tells me, that's that pattern, or it's that pattern, and it turns out that I had an idea for something that is so similar to something that is written in one of our design pattern books that someone had already learned about it. That happens all the time, but I argue that that is a better way for you to learn about architecture and design patterns and stuff like that than it is for you to just go and go around reading a bunch of books and then try to spot the things, because then you're reversing it. It's better for you to learn by doing which architecture is going to work and which is not going to work, or work in various systems where they might have really shitty system with one architecture, and then really reflect on why is it that this architecture isn't working here? Why is it working over there but not here? Those insights are critical. And when you can answer that question, as I said, if you work in one company where a monolithic application is really shitty, for example, ask yourself why. And if you work in, I promise you, if you work long enough, you're going to see at least one example where a monolith works really, really well. And you ask why? Why is it working now? Why didn't it work earlier? Microservices, the same deal. Why is it working pretty well here, but it's not working pretty well over here? Those insights are the most important ones. And if you're going to start somewhere, start with that monolith versus microservices, or so on, depending on what you're talking about, because those are the two main architectures that practically every software team in every single company is using in some format. The others are there. They are usually more advanced and a little bit more niched. Those two are like, it's bread and butter. Practically every system has it. Have a great day.